Hi, I'm Eva McManaman. I'm the Senior Qualification Manager for Modern Languages at Pearson. In this short launch video, I'm going to focus on papers 2 and 3. That's our listening and reading papers. Okay, so how do your students feel about the listening and reading papers? How do you feel about listening and reading papers? We're well aware that there were a range of issues that we needed to resolve, and these are some of the ones that we've listed. For listening, you often told us that the speaking speed was too fast, that the texts are too long. There wasn't enough pause time to write answers and no opportunity to even check answers. That there was a difficulty of understanding the questions in the target language and the cognitive overload of long texts and complex questions and the reliance on memory with the listening exam. Now, all of that creates a situation in which we have got an assessment which students really dislike, but they come out feeling unhappy about it. And often because the listening and reading papers were timetabled together, one would affect the other, and their morale and confidence. And obviously that's a situation that we need to reverse. That's the listening. The issues for the reading, some of them are quite similar, but just to walk through them, there's the fact that the content is not seen as being inclusive or relatable. There's often unfamiliar cultural content, which is confusing for the students. Texts have been considered too long, and the questions, again, in target language are very difficult. You often have told us that you feel like those questions have been created to trick the students, and that the inference questions were testing a cognitive ability rather than language knowledge. Now, you'll be glad to know that some of the things that the DfE have put in place are actually going to remove some of these issues. So the fact that questions will no longer be in the target language is something that the DfE has put in their subject content. So that is a great change. But all the other things listed here, we have been thinking very carefully about at Pearson as to how we could resolve these issues. So that's what I'm going to talk through as I walk you through these slides. So I'm going to begin by walking through the basic details of the two papers and starting with the paper 2 on listening. It has two sections. Section A is the listening comprehension for 40 marks of the 50 marks available. All questions will be written in English and any responses to open response questions will be in English also. For this paper, the students will be listening to each extract 3 times with appropriate pausing. Why can we do 3 times now? Well, that's because Ofqual have lifted the maximum time limit for the listening exam, which is on the current qualification. So we've taken advantage of this opportunity to allow the student to hear each extract 3 times, and I will pick up on that a little bit more detail later. Something else to say about these extracts is that they will be at no faster than a moderate pace, and that is the exact wording from the DfE subject content that every awarding organisation must comply with. So that is slightly slower than the current qualification. Section B is the dictation, that's 10 marks of the 50 marks. In the dictation, the students will encounter both gap fill and the requirement to write complete sentences from what they're listening to. These sentences will be thematically linked, so at least they can get their ear in to the content, and if there's something that they're not quite sure of, they can maybe make an educated guess about what the word might have been. However, it will include vocabulary from outside of the vocabulary list, as that was a requirement of the subject content also. And we will accept spellings, which are alternative ways of rendering the SSC. We've got lots of details about that in our mark scheme, which we're really proud of because we wanted to ensure that it was compassionate and took account of some of the nuances of the French language and the fact that some sounds can be rendered by different symbols. It doesn't mean that you've heard the wrong sound. So here are the details of the papers, just to emphasise that generous assessment time that we have for both the foundation and higher tier because of the requirement that we wanted of listening 3 times. And also just to emphasise that the text word count is what is given to us by Ofqual, and so that is the same for all awarding organisations. So we have the same amount of content as any other awarding organisation, but just spread across more time. For paper 3, reading, here are the basic details. So section A, reading comprehension, 40 marks. Very similar to the listening comprehension in terms of the structures, all questions in English, respond to open response in English. So we've got 10 marks left, and those are the ones for translation. So very clear structures, and you can help your students with planning their time perhaps. And finally, the details about the content. And like I said, that information about text word count is the same for all the awarding organisations because that's come directly from Ofqual and their requirements. One thing to emphasise about our translation is even with the foundation tier where there's 5 separate sentences, they will still be on a related subject area. So again, just like with a dictation, the student can get their kind of eye in on the translation rather than their ear in, and they can get a sense of perhaps what it is they're reading and maybe be able to make that judgment, which you do when you're kind of reading language that you maybe don't fully understand. So, what do we think we needed to do? And we thought it was create confidence. We need our students to feel much more confident about their reading and listening skills and they can complete these papers. So we've ensured that we have carefully constructed papers, that all our texts are level appropriate, so GCSE level appropriate, and with the language complexity that matches. Obviously, there has to be variation because we need to differentiate across the tiers and we need to differentiate across the grades, but the language should be of that appropriate for a GCSE student. Also with the questions, we have aimed very much to not have any tricks. I will show you an example of a way in which we've tried to avoid the tricks which you've told us about. We've also got a really consistent assessment structure, and we think this is really important because we know how much you like to practice with past papers and how important it is for the student to feel like they understand the structure and what's going to happen next in the paper. It gives them that confidence, which means that they can continue through. So one example of consistent assessment structure is that we have the same question types, so multiple choice question, open response question, in the same place for the same number of marks every time, every exam series. So your students and you can prepare. Also, it helps with you for comparison of results through mocks, for example, and seeing where students are struggling and where they need to improve. This point about the questions being in order of answer appearance in the text. So what we mean here is that, for example, in a reading text, the first question about that reading text is likely to refer to something which is near the beginning of that reading text, and the last question for that reading text is likely to be related to something near the end of that text. So the questions should work their way through the text and they shouldn't be hopping around for the students. And finally, on the reading and listening papers, we've worked very hard to ensure there was steady ramping of question difficulty as the paper progresses. People have different opinions about the ramping of questions on exam papers, but what we think is that for our students, if they receive a really difficult question, it actually can knock their confidence so much that they don't even continue with the paper. And we want to ensure that they try their very best to move as far as they can along, so we help them along by making sure the questions are ramped. So on this slide, I'm going to focus on our careful construction of text and the questions. This text that you have in front of you is actually question 7 on the reading for foundation, but it's also one of the crossover questions, so it appears on the higher tier as question 2. Just to highlight, all the vocabulary in this text is vocabulary that is in the vocabulary list, except for one, and that's avocat. At the end there, as you can see, it's been italicised and emboldened, and that's because this is the word that will be used for the inference question, which I'll talk about in a moment. Hopefully, you'll see that the contents of this text has been carefully constructed to be applicable for the age level. But what I want to focus on more is the questions that were created. And here's one example of a way in which we've tried to improve the structure of our question. So here's an example of how the old question, or the first draft of this question, was constructed. Where we had very long options, which a student would have to kind of read through each of them to really understand. And within them, there's those negatives, some of them are framed negatively, no longer, no solution, and some kind of framed in the positive, although most worried, obviously, is a negative view. And in all, that's kind of quite a cognitive overload for the students to work through. A better structured question, which is still testing the same content and the same understanding, is here. So she is concerned there are still issues with racism, safety, sexism. It's exactly the same options as in the previous question, but the structure of the question has actually been improved to ensure that the student can access it, and therefore we are testing their ability to access the text and their understanding of the text and language, not their ability to access a question. Another element that we learned in our student research was about the students' preference for the chunking of text. That large elements of text, large extracts of text, really can put them off and make them feel a little bit overwhelmed. So both in reading and in listening, we have broken down larger text into smaller sections, then followed by a number of questions after each smaller section. Here you can see what the students said about that in terms of it being easy to understand how the extract corresponds to each question, making the question less overwhelming and easier to think about when it's in short paragraphs. So that's another element that we've ensured that we include in our assessments to support our students. So our research showed that the listening paper is one which causes a huge amount of anxiety for students and makes them very stressed. We want to reverse that trend and we want them to start feeling calm in the listening exam. They tell us that it's a bit like the 110 metres sprint with the hurdles and that they are just exhausted by the end of it. And of course, in the current qualifications, sometimes the listening and reading papers are timetabled against each other, so how they feel about one will affect what happens in the other, or they may already be tired from having completed the reading one before the listening. We need to reverse all these trends, and we wanted to feel more like a brisk walk around the park. It has to be a little bit testing, it is an exam, but it shouldn't be so stressful for the students. So we've done that by having 3 lessons. We've taken the factor of core lifted at maximum time limit and ensured that we can play the extracts 3 times so students can first of all understand what they're hearing, then answer their question, and then most importantly have that moment to check what they heard and check that they put the right thing down. Because obviously with listening, they can't come back to it at the end of the exam to check their answers in the way they can in the reading paper or the way they can check their vocabulary, spelling, grammar in a writing task. It's something that we really wanted to help them with within the exam. We also ensure that the pauses will get longer as the texts become more complex or the questions are open response and students actually have to write a response. Those shorter questions at the beginning of a foundation tier multiple choice question, they won't have such long pauses between the repeats or between questions, but as the paper progresses, the students hopefully will feel like they're being given enough time to get their responses down, so they don't feel like they're in that 110 metre hurdles. The students said it's good to have more time on questions and to separate them better. Another aspect that is really important for the listening exam to prevent that issue of cognitive overload that's caused by relying on the student's memory is to chunk the text so that they listen to one chunk of an extract, have the questions that they have to answer for that one. They listen to that one 3 times, and then they have the next chunk of the extract 3 times and the questions below it. And that way they don't have to retain so much information before they are responding to the questions. That combined with the 3 listens and the better pausing, obviously it's all going to make a much better experience for our students. On the dictation, that new element of the qualification, we've created a really compassionate mark scheme. The dictation should be about the student's ability to understand the sounds of the language and render them correctly. Now, what is correct when in a language like French, some things which sound the same might not actually be written the same. We need to kind of tread that fine line between assessing their understanding of sound symbol correspondence or as just assessing their spelling or their grammar knowledge. And we wanted to make sure that we were rewarding students in a supportive manner. So how are we helping students feel that they can succeed in the reading paper? One way in which we've done this is by looking at ensuring that the inference task is straightforward and it is a minimal single word inference as required by the DfE subject content. We're making sure that we've identified a word that is going to be inferred for the students by using the emboldening and the italicisation in the text. So when a student comes across the word which is not on the vocabulary list, they can instantly know, oh, that's okay, I don't know it because it's the one I have to infer. And as you can see, the actual question type for the inference question is a very simple multiple choice. How do we ensure that students feel included in our reading paper? What we've tried to do is, as much as possible, set the extracts in familiar context for the students. So for examples, it might be things about technology or in the school, healthy living or podcasts about the environment. Hopefully these will be all familiar features to students, familiar contexts. However, we also want to ensure there is some cultural aspects to our papers. But if that happens, we know that for some students it might be unfamiliar. We don't know how much access students have had to the actual cultures of the target language they're learning. So here we've got an example of a text about beaches in Paris, and there's an online article about artificial beaches in Paris, and we've provided a supportive image because of course some students might not realise that Paris is not on the coast, and what an artificial beach might even look like. They might not have had the privilege of going somewhere where there's an artificial beach. So this is why we've ensured that we've included an image to support that. Where there are images, we of course will have out text that will be used for the partially sighted students accessing the language exams. Another way in which we're trying to prevent the cultural barriers which can come up in reading and listening is to think about the names that we're using for the people that appear in the papers. I think you agree that in some of the current qualification papers, there's been a wide range of names used, and sometimes these are really unfamiliar to the students. So what we've ensured we've done is in the specification, in the Appendix 3, we have a list of girls' names and boys' names appropriate to teenage students in those target language speaking countries. And we also have a range of names that can be used both by boys and girls, and there's actually a few adult names because sometimes adults do appear. And what we will do is always use these names. We won't be using any others, and therefore you can familiarise your students with these names. They might not know whether Fatia is the name of a boy or a girl. They might not have ever heard of a Dorian for a boy's name or an Ahmed. You know, it's something that we are very aware of. That it's a simple step for us to remove this little barrier to students. We're trying to remove any surprises or unfamiliar material because we want the students to be able to focus on the content that is being assessed and not the additional ephemeral stuff which actually isn't important for their grade in the end. And we are allowed to gloss proper nouns now. So where we do use a proper noun, if we do use a name of a country or a city, we will be glossing that underneath to make it clear to the student what this place or this person is. So just as a little activity for you to put yourself in the situation of your students, we've got a little text here about the Eisteddfod. And anyone who's a Welsh speaker, apologies now for anything that I don't pronounce correctly. But if you took some time to read this, I think what would happen is that for a majority of us, even though the words, the majority of them are quite clear, what would we focus on? It's of course all these words which look a bit strange. Now, that's for someone who's not a Welsh speaker, of course. They are all proper nouns, and therefore, if they were included in a text in one of our new exams, they would have been glossed. But as you can see, it causes the distraction, it causes a hindrance in your reading. So even if the questions are simple about the text, the fact that there's these really unfamiliar aspects, they can actually cause you little kind of jolts as you're trying to read and understand. So there's a number of features which I've now walked through on about the listening and reading papers. And I wonder which ones are your favourites, but I just want to kind of summarise all the things that we've done to try and improve the accessibility of these papers and to ensure that your students have a much better experience with the new qualifications. So we have the free listens with the appropriate pausing between repeats and questions. We've got a moderate speaking pace. We've got chunking of text and the style of our inference questions. Our work that we've done on trying to have cultural inclusivity, how we've used images in our reading paper, and our clear and transparent question styles, and the fact that we have a consistent question paper structure every exam series. And I hope this all goes to support you with the delivery of these qualifications.